Hello, everybody who's joining this virtual event today. My name is Rachel. I am a bookseller here at Boswell Book Company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Today is day 5,269 of Boswell being in business, and we are, of course, continuing our virtual event series with Porchlight Book Company, one of our greatest book selling friends out there. Talking to our featured author of the afternoon is Sally Haldorson, who is the managing director of Porchlight Book Company, and you're in great hands with her. So take it away, Sally.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And welcome to everyone who's joining us. Many of us will have known Amy Edmondson for her preeminent work on psychological safety in organizations. The definition of psychological safety is a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes, and that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. A natural extension of psychological safety then is how we create those spaces, or even the mindset to allow ourselves and others to be wrong, to fail in an attempt to improve and learn and progress. Much of what we think about failure is encapsulated and made trite in viral terminology like fail fast, fail often, or we bandy about reassurances of persistence and resistance as though failing is all about the building up of scar tissue. Many of us have been motivated by Samuel Beckett's famous quote about failure: ever tried, ever failed, no matter, try again, fail better. Beckett's words were intended to teach us actually that there is only failure, that success is actually unattainable, that reaching a final destination is an impossibility. Perhaps, but the question remains, how? How do we fail better? What's missing is the guidance on how to learn from intelligent failures, how to avoid basic failures, and how to unravel and prevent complex failures. Amy Edmondson's new book does just that. While failure is inevitable because we are humans who strive to create and solve, failure does not have to be an end to itself. It should instead invite improvement, be iterative. Learning to learn from failure and how to establish habits and environments where good failures are welcome, benefit us all, is the great gift of Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well, available September 12th from Atria Books. And we are honored to welcome Amy to the conversation. Hi, Amy.
Hi, Sally. Thank you so much for having me.
We are so excited to have you in this conversation. And I mentioned right before we started that I have been a fan of your work for a while, and your previous book, The Fearless Organization, which is about psychological safety, which is why I started out with that, has been really meaningful to me in the development of my skill set as a manager. And I think that not only can people benefit from that, but this book in particular is going to give us some skills at the individual and the company and the societal level where we can actually create those safe spaces. So this is going to be really exciting. And let's start out first. I'd like to give you the floor. Tell us what brought you to write this book on failure.
You know, there are different ways I can explain this, but let me try one. The first one that comes to mind is that I have been surprised, over the last even 5 years or so, how many people are still confused about failure. I guess I've been thinking about failure and psychological safety for so long that I tend to think of the things that I write and teach about as quite obvious, but then I'll go into organizations and I hear people saying things that indicate that they're still struggling. But they're still struggling. There's almost an ongoing tension between, failure is great. Silicon Valley, fail fast, fail often, break things, and then another camp that is saying, hold on here, I live in the real world. Where I work, where I live, failure is not an option, or, only good performance or hitting your targets is acceptable around here. And it seems so clear to me that it depends, right?
Mhm.
Under what conditions really becomes the issue. Under what conditions is it okay to fail and fail fast? And under what conditions isn't it? And let's start there and then sort out kind of the different kinds of failure, the failure landscape, so that we can have more intelligent and productive conversations about failure, and frankly, have better practices around failure. Because the reality is things will go wrong, right? In our lives, in our jobs, in our projects, things will go wrong. But there's so many ways we can do better to prevent things from going wrong that can be prevented, than to welcome the things that go wrong that can't be prevented. Now, I know that's all quite abstract. So I wanted to write this book to kind of share these insights that I've gotten over, I think, the last 30 years of research, and make them easy and accessible and practicable. So psychological safety was, and I was so thrilled to be able to write that book, and by the attention it got, and by the attention that the concept has gotten. But it describes the environment in which all these good things can happen: learning, experimenting, innovating, catching and correcting error. Now I'm putting the spotlight right on, well, what is it that we do? How do our lives unfold? How does the work unfold? And what is the role of failure and the different kinds of failure in those activities?
I had an experience, so obviously I've had the privilege of reading this book ahead of time. And I actually had, when you mentioned practicable, and as a very difficult word for me to say in the moment, you mentioned that you want for people to be able to actually use this book. And right before I came here, I had just a really minor incident where we got a phone call from my son's school. It's his first day of school in a new program. And, we sent him off, and he has something that I knew that he uses that I knew was being a little flaky the last, 2 weeks or so. Sort of, I knew it was just not behaving the way that it should be behaving, but it wasn't a problem because we were home during the summer, and he was with people who knew how to handle anything that went wrong with this piece of equipment. And so, of course, we send him off to school today, and we get a phone call right before I come here saying this mechanism died, right? And I knew it was because of the thing that I didn't do when I first saw the signs that there was something going wrong. So I say to my husband, I'm like, this is a good example of a basic failure where, I got complacent and didn't do the thing that I've done for 10 years with this piece of equipment in checking it and making sure that it's working properly. But because of just a certain familiarity with it, I didn't do what I needed to do to prevent this from happening. Now, I normally would beat myself up and say, oh, I can't believe I made that mistake. How embarrassing, but it really helped me to frame this in the sense of it being a lesson to be learned, that my overlooking this one step caused this to happen. Will not do that in the future, sort of to disassociate from that emotional reaction to making a mistake, but also then to be able to move on with it. And I feel like that's a big component of this book. And so let's start with those basics. I'm going to again, and why it's important to identify different types of failure and why it is useful to do that.
Well, I think it's important in a way because it's useful, and because it changes how we think, which can phenomenally matter for your emotional state, right? So you said you just described a story in which you went from being at risk for beating yourself up and feeling, either embarrassed or ashamed or both. And that can really ruin your day, and also narrow your thinking, and paradoxically make it harder, not easier, for you to do better next time. But if you can approach it more dispassionately, like, oh, it's interesting. I failed to do this. I made this little mistake, and it actually had an impact. And like looking at it almost scientifically, then I think you have a better shot at preventing it next time. But so maybe it will help if I say what I have discovered or articulated is three kinds of failure, and there's three kinds, but really only one of the three is the good kind, is the right kind of wrong. Only one of and I call those intelligent failures. So I think I'll start there, and I do that in the book too.
Yep.
And intelligent failures are the truly inevitable failures when you're stretching yourself or challenging or venturing off into new territory of any kind. So intelligent failures happen when you're in new territory. You really haven't done this before, right? So you should not have the expectation that everything will go perfectly in new territory. So in new territory, in pursuit of a goal, whether that's getting your kid to school or for the first time, let's say, or, finish, inventing a new something, device, or creating a project, a success at work. So in pursuit of a goal, in new territory, where you have reason to believe it might work. This thing that you're trying that you've never done before, it might work. You have a hypothesis, as it were. And finally, the failure is as small as possible for you to learn, right? So you don't bet the farm on an uncertain outcome, right? So those are intelligent failures, and they are the ones that are arguably not preventable if you're in new territory, but we are tempted, since we don't like failure, human beings don't like failure at all, you're tempted to not want to experience them. Right. And the best way to do that is just not venture into new territory, right? Just stay in your lane, do the things you know how to do well, don't stretch, don't pick up a new sport, don't try a new hobby, don't make new friends, all of those things that are clearly not good advice for a full and rich life. Would be the only way to avoid intelligent failures is just to never do anything at all outside your comfort zone. And so let's put those aside for a second. The other two are basic failures, which you've already alluded to. And those are the failures that happen because you make a mistake. A single mistake produces a failure. It could be a very small failure, like the one you described, or it could be a catastrophic failure, like a pilot not using the checklist properly, making a mistake, and experiencing a devastating airplane crash, right? Same phenomenon, right? A single mistake leading to an outcome that is a failure, not what we wanted, but a bad outcome. So basic failure doesn't mean a small failure, it means a single cause failure. And then complex failures are the perfect storms. They're the several factors came together in just the wrong way to produce a failure. And any one of those factors on their own would not have led to failure, right? They weren't dangerous on their own, but the fact that they lined up in just the wrong way. Now, many medication errors in hospital settings, where I've done a lot of my research, qualify as complex failures. You might have someone who's not used to being in this particular medical service. That in itself is maybe a risk factor, but it's not going to directly lead to a failure. But then when you couple that with a strangely labeled medication and a dark corner, suddenly the wrong drug gets given, right? And the dark corner wasn't a problem by itself. The strange labeling wasn't a problem by itself, but you brought all of these factors together and you led to an undesired outcome. And so part of the book and part of the science of failing well, I think, is mastering the practices that help us prevent preventable failures. And most basic failures and most complex failures are theoretically preventable when we're at our very best. But intelligent failures are not. So intelligent failures are the right kind, the good kind, and ironically not preventable, because they bring us something new. They bring us new discoveries, new knowledge.
So I think that one of the things so here you've identified 3 different types of failures, and we'll dig into those. But I think even with all three, even with one of them being good and two of them not being good or the right kind of failure, that there is still something to be gained from, because these are inevitable, there's something to be gained from identifying any of them, especially since the way that we have been brought up to view failure, more likely than not, and you mention in the book about that, at some point, children's brains have a tendency to sort of lean into thinking that they don't have the sort of a right and wrong fixed mindset versus growth mindset, that over time we develop this idea that failures are bad, period. And we don't then extend that out to depending on what we do with them. And so there are a lot of us who were raised in environments where failure was dealt with punitively or perhaps discouraged because it was, any sort of even creative failure was too much to deal with. It was outside of the norm. There's so much of those kinds of constraints that we grow up with. And so this framework allows us to see even the failures that are the wrong type, the wrong kind, as being contributing to progress, because we're going to do something in the next step after we identify what it is. Yeah. And so how do we, for those of us who still, as you've mentioned, have that little bit of like, I just am not really comfortable with this, talking about failure in a really open kind of way, what's the first step in I think you, I don't know if I'm going to say this right, but befriending failure. Befriending it.
I do use that term. So it's true. So yes, one important point is that there are different kinds of failure and they have different implications. But another important point, as you just said, is we can learn from any failure. Right? Every failure has lessons that it can teach us. And that part, I think we have to welcome the lessons, right? We're at risk for not learning them, right? Because we'd so much rather turn around. We have a natural aversion to failure. Our own anyway. We don't mind checking out other people's failures for sure, but we have such an aversion to failure that we are at risk for not gaining the lessons that each one has to offer, right? And if you have a recurring experience of failure that comes from having said yes to too many things or being perennially late for something, you can and should do the work of pausing to say, okay, why is this continuing to happen? And what do I need to change, right? About my own behavior, my own actions, to prevent that from happening again. And most of the time, it's pretty easy to identify, one or two things that you might be able to do differently and avoid some of the failures that really are wearing you down. And so I think the befriending comes from it's like I call it reframing, right? When you reframe it from, well, this was bad and I'm bad because this happened too. Okay, this was disappointing. And I wonder what I can learn, right? And suddenly I'm gaining. I just realized I can gain something. Still disappointing, but at least I get to gain something that's going to help me going forward. So it's a shift from it's just bad and I don't want to look at it to, all right, don't love it, but facing forward, this has value for me.
There's so much about this book that is about curiosity, I think, right? That intelligent failure is really failure that comes from being curious and trialing something and taking a risk. But then also how we respond to failure requires a curiosity, right? So let's dig in a little bit to intelligent failures and maybe an example that comes from your research, and then how curiosity sparked the experiment. I'm thinking right now about the heart surgeon, which is a very stressful story, which I will let you tell. I'm just going to hint at it. But then in understanding that the failure of the surgeries over time, if we had stopped when we failed, we would not have made the progress that we have got.
Precisely. Yeah.
If I'm giving you enough of a hint of which story that I'm talking
Right.
about.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. And no, and this is a story I was so enriched by looking into. And I had studied cardiac surgery teams as part of my earlier research. I've spent a lot of time studying healthcare and hospitals in general, but I had not known of these early experiences in open heart surgery that started in the early 50s. And so specifically, just to zoom in on a kind of a moment in time, in April of 1951, a surgeon named Dr. Clarence Dennis, was operating on a 5-year-old girl who had been born with essentially a fatal heart defect. Now she was 5 years old, but she was not going to live much longer, given the hole in her heart. And in a sense, this is such a brave thing to do. Right? The surgeon decided he would try to cut and repair this damaged vessel. And he tried, and without going into too much gory detail, he failed. It turned out actually that there was more holes in her heart than had been anticipated, and it just was impossible to repair them fast enough. But let's step back and say, beyond just this one instance, this is a very hard thing to do. And as I'm sure all of our listeners know, today this is something we literally take for granted, right? This miracle of being able to operate and repair a diseased heart on a living person is and should be thought of as miraculous. But we wouldn't have gotten to this taken for granted miracle today had we not been willing to tolerate some of those early failures. Now, there were a series of such experiments, I guess, with living patients, but in every single case, the patient had no other option. Right? They were at risk of very near death if they did nothing, so they're willing to take those kinds of risks. Now, let's take a look at how this adheres to the principles of intelligent failure. It's new territory, right? Nobody knows how to repair the heart through surgery of a living human. There's good reason to believe it might be possible. And we're not operating on a healthy person who would otherwise go on to live a full and healthy life. We are operating on someone who has no other option. So that's how the failure is as small as possible, if you will. And of course, these amazing surgeons had done their homework. They'd done everything they could to figure out what was possible medically and surgically. They were trying to solve the really tough problem of how do you make the heart stay still when it wants to pump blood, and the person will die if blood isn't pumping. So you have to invent a machine that helps pump the blood while you're operating on the still heart, and so on and so forth. Many details, but the journey, it actually was a several years long journey to the point where the first truly successful open heart surgery happened. That advance, that life-saving advance, would not have been possible without the willingness to boldly experiment with things we did not know how to do, and the willingness to kind of endure the inevitable failures along the way to success.
There are a number of stories that you include in the book that are big stories, right? This one was a big story. The story about Boeing and their 737s is a big story, and these
complex
are big disasters with big consequences. But I think one of the takeaways from your book is that it isn't as much as the consequence matters. And don't get me wrong, that the lives mattered in these big stories, but the consequences are often the things that can drive us to look for solutions and create the next new thing. But if we can get to those errors or mistakes and we can address them early on before they become so big that they take human lives, then that is a methodology that's incredibly useful for all of us to put into practice much early on. So I get what I'm trying to say, I think, is that we have the failure, but the failure to some degree is disconnected to the consequence. But we often think that it's the consequence that drives us to look at failure.
Right.
If that makes
Right.
sense. And
No,
so I
does.
think what your book is so good at doing is saying that, you know, a consequence of a basic failure. I was explaining this book to my husband yesterday, and I said, like running a stop sign, right? Like, because I was texting on my phone.
Right. Or
And
you were
it was-
late and just didn't, you know,
yeah,
whatever.
and didn't see it, right? So it's a basic failure of distraction or fatigue or whatever it is that we end up
Right.
doing. And that in and of itself, because it was a stop sign on a deserted road, it doesn't have a consequence other than maybe your own like
Oh,
consciousness,
okay.
right?
Right.
But then we have a complex failure, which might be the stop sign was obscured by a tree that should have been cut down by the city, but the city's budget is in distress. And because the city's budget is distressed, they haven't hired enough workers to go out and cut the trees, right? So there's a continual
Right.
cost. But maybe even then you run the stop sign and nothing happens.
Sure.
You know, so we often, unless you run the stop sign and you get into a fender bender, you run the stop sign and there's someone in the road, it's the consequence that drives the desire to solve the failure. When in actuality, we can get there before that.
Yes. So there's another way to talk about this, which is that you can make a mistake, and I make many a day, right? That doesn't, you know, whether good luck or just, no one was there, etc., that doesn't result in a failure. Right. And those mistakes don't lead to much reflection at all. Because it's sort of like you dodged, you got away with it. So you almost start to think, in fact, there's a whole theory on this of normal deviance, or you almost start to think, well, that's fine. It's fine to just do a rolling rather than a full stop, right? Yeah. Because you don't get those consequences. So you're right. We are so trained to think of the consequence as the only thing that matters rather than the process. Rather than being interested in the process and how we can improve the process and do better, and not be playing Russian roulette with our stop signs or our activity in vehicles. So, but it is one of the things I hope to do for readers of this book is to disambiguate the words failure and mistake. They are not synonymous, and I often hear them used synonymously. And particularly one of the places I hear it more often than not is where people are referring to mistakes when they're actually talking about something in new territory, right? They're trying something that has never been tried before and it doesn't work. And they go, okay, well, we made a mistake. We got a mistake and that's too bad, but let's try again. It's like, no, you can't make a mistake when there's no recipe to follow that you deviated from, right? Well, we have traffic laws. If you violate them, that is a mistake, right? Or worse, a deliberate act of deviance. But the failure, in fact, does describe, or at least the way I talk about it, does describe the outcome, the undesired outcome.
Right.
No such thing as a desired failure. It's an undesired. If you're a scientist doing an experiment and you hope you're right. If you're wrong, it's okay. You still learn from it, but you still, like any human, hoped you were right. And so mistakes can lead to failures. Not all mistakes will cause a failure. That can make us complacent or lazy or non-curious.
Yep.
And not all failures are caused by mistakes, right? Some are caused by either complex set of factors coming together in a problematic way or by thoughtful experiments in new territory.
That's an important distinction. And I think the other thing that you stress in the book in relation to that is that when we do say, when we almost mimic the behavior of saying, oh, we made a mistake, or, oh, that failed.
Yeah.
But, move on, do the next thing. That if we don't take that time to reflect on it, because we think accepting failure means to not
dwell on it.
Aside, to
Right.
cover it up, or to not even cover it up, but just to
move on.
That's the past, right?
Right.
And if we don't take that time to reflect on it, if we aren't in a psychologically safe environment where we can fess up to it, we can talk about it, we can try to solve it together, then we never actually turn that
right.
that mistake into the next step. And I think that is, we have that, again, that dovetailing of why it's important to have a psychologically safe environment where people don't hide their failures. And that reminds me of the story that you opened the book with, which is one of your early research projects, but that you found out that teams that are able to report a mistake or failures, now I'm being very
and mistakes. No, and mistakes, right?
I mean, report any kind of
right.
Where they get tripped up, where they're able to report those mistakes or those failures, leads to more reporting, which sort of threw you off your hypothesis to start with, right? Because you thought that teams that had worked together really well would have less errors, but in actuality it looked like they had more errors until you realized that they were just able to talk about them and surface them.
Right.
And so the benefit there, of course, is that we're not pushing them aside. We're actually taking and learning from them.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I was almost, I'm so glad you're bringing us back to psychological safety, because I was almost surprised as I was writing this book by how many times I realized I had to bring psychological safety back in to these practices. Because psychological safety is absolutely crucial for safe practices in high risk settings like healthcare or nuclear power or aviation, settings where there's an inherent risk of when things go wrong, really, really bad things happen. Right. Psychological safety plays an absolutely vital role in those contexts but because it is necessary for speaking up, right? So people need to know that it's okay to speak up. And as you said, in my very early research, I realized, wow, there's remarkable differences across groups in people's sort of almost taken for granted behavior around speaking up about mistakes, or their beliefs that it's acceptable or unacceptable differed wildly. That was a surprise, right? That was a kind of discovery along the way. And as you described, it did involve a failure of my original hypothesis, which turned out to be okay because what I discovered was more interesting than my original hypothesis. So, like many failures in research, welcome it, because it feels like bad news, it feels lousy, but more often than not, it's taking you somewhere else that is interesting. And so psychological safety really matters for helping people speak up about mistakes so that we have every chance at preventing preventable failures. And it also matters for people's willingness to take bold experiments, right? To be willing to try things in new territory that might not work.
Let's, what I was sort of terming as the pink elephant in the room, while I was reading the book, you mentioned a few times, and you have a diagram that lays this out as well. A lot of times when we talk about it being accepting of failure, the reaction perhaps to those we are performing for might say that there are things at risk in being too accommodating to failure, and that is performance and accountability. And so if we're just like, oh, hey, do whatever, try whatever you need to try, you know,
Right.
we'll just discuss it when it's complete. What it doesn't do, and I think it is a difficult thing to deal with for leaders and managers, is where does the accountability come in then? Where are my how do I hold someone to high standards if I don't maybe
Punish failure.
failure, or at the very least, disencourage it? So how do you flip that in the book to make us think differently about that?
Yeah. The short answer is context matters greatly. The longer answer is you're absolutely right. There is this understandable worry that if we are welcoming failure, we're being permissive and supporting sloppiness, not trying. And context allows us to sort of to solve this problem, and in the following way. In new territory, it's quite clear, you don't have a formula, right? You don't have a recipe for how to get the result you want. And so if you are not welcoming the results of thoughtful experiments, you're really not pursuing excellence at all, right? So in other words, it's helping people to understand that this is what high standards looks like in new territory. In new territory, high standards means we have ambitious goals. We've done our homework to think through what we're going to try next. We've had thoughtful, honest conversations. We try it, didn't work. We have to train ourselves to say, great, we just got new information. What next, right? Where do we go next? Because that's what good looks like in new territory. Now, let's, for the sake of argument, go all the way to the other side. Let's go somewhere where the knowledge about how to produce the result we want is crystal clear. Right? We've got a vehicle that's being assembled on the assembly line in a factory, and we want it to come off the line at the end of the day perfect, right? And here we need to be tolerant, not of failure, because there's no real reason we should be experiencing a failure here, a big failure, that is, because we know how to make it. We can pursue Six Sigma quality, where there's 1 in a million parts are defective in some way. And so here, what you're looking to welcome is early reports of, I'm not quite sure this looks right. So it's like a tiny scale failure compared to the failure in new territory, but it's this welcoming of anyone who's willing and able to raise their hand to say, this doesn't look quite right, is your new best friend, right? You're sort of saying, if we want to be excellent, we have got to welcome all input that suggests something might be off along the way. And also, what good looks like is working really hard to follow the recipe, to do it precisely. And if you're feeling tired or you can't continue to pay attention because you've been on an overly long shift, please say so we can get the support you need, right? So it's not permissiveness. It's actually a commitment to excellence in a reality-based world rather than a magical world, right? A magical world is if I'm sort of tough enough and say, we have high standards around here, then everybody will magically do great work. Nonsense, right? It's like, let's be clear about where we are. How much knowledge do we have about how to get the result we want? What capabilities do we have to produce, those activities? And what do you need to be able to do that well? And welcoming, if you don't welcome failure, whether it's new or old, you are doomed to repeat it a second time.
I was thinking about, I had a note here about the false alarms and the Toyota's alert system that they have, and welcoming that, and then how that sort of gets connected to, vulnerability and shame and all the feelings that we feel when we are the ones who try to raise our hand and either note something that we see destined to fail, or are concerned but perhaps wrong. And you talk in here about blame and vulnerability, what are some of the ways that we can shore ourselves up to both be brave to try new things, but also be brave to speak up when we see something is possibly going to fail?
I think it starts by recognizing how hard it is, right? And not hard in some kind of like Olympic athlete hard, but how natural it is to hold back, right? If I see something, if I'm not sure, if I see something that might be wrong, but it might not be, it is 1,000 times easier to just to wait and see, right? Maybe someone else will speak up about it, right? Like, and maybe I'm wrong, and I don't like the idea of saying it and then being wrong. So 1,000 times easier to just hold back and wait and see. And what you want to do, to create a really, world-class team environment, learning environment, is make it 1,000 times easier to speak up, even if you're wrong, like to just help people see that that's actually a better way to be. How do you do that? Well, you make frequent references to how valuable it is. You reward, as you said earlier, the false alarms, right? When people come and say, or people say, I think this might not be working right, and then you investigate it and it is working right, you don't say, see, you were wrong. You say, thank you so much for bringing it to my attention, because next time it could in fact have been a crippling problem that would have brought down the plane, right? So it's about always welcoming learning behavior, and always welcoming people's willingness to speak up even with doubt, because we live in a profoundly uncertain and complex world. So we're going to experience doubt a lot. And if doubt keeps us quiet, we're in trouble.
I think the one of the sort of larger takeaways from the book that I got is it's a good reminder, just what you said right here, is that we can do all the work we possibly can to prepare ourselves for success or for completing a project or a goal and meeting the metrics that we've laid out. But we aren't in charge of the world, and we aren't in control of the world, and things happen that we don't foresee or that we can't plan for. And we talk a lot about like crisis management planning in organizations, and something that you write, which seems like a good rule to live by when doing so, is, I'm going to just quote this real quick: embrace the possibility of failure to reduce the occurrence of failure.
Yeah.
Which I feel like I'm gonna put somewhere on my desk.
Right.
Why is it so hard for us to do this? Embrace the possibility of failure to reduce the occurrence of failure. And how does confirmation bias get in the way? You mentioned one just there, that it's easier to say, oh, we'll just wait and see, rather than to raise your hand. But in what other ways are we sort of getting in our own way of recognizing and attending to failure before failure actually happens?
Sure. I think there's 3 dimensions of this. One is that just the social stigma, right? I don't want to stand out. I especially don't want to stand out for being wrong. If I say I think that might be a problem and I'm wrong, it's embarrassing, except unless you've done a lot of work to create an environment where it's not embarrassing. It's welcome. It's appreciated. So one is, the sort of the stigma of being wrong. Another is just the natural, almost emotional aversion to failure that we have. Like, it's hard to embrace the possibility of failure. I'd so much rather not embrace the possibility of failure. Like, I'd so much rather assume all will be well, right? And the truth is, things can be well, but only if we do our part to help them be well. So there's that just kind of emotional aversion to thinking about. And you don't want to be a pessimist who's, always looking for all the things that could go wrong, unless very high stakes, very high risk environments. You absolutely want to be that person who's always looking for what could go wrong, because you will be a lifesaver. And then you mentioned the confirmation bias, and that's essentially a cognitive factor that makes this hard, which is we do tend to believe that we have an idea of what should happen, and then we basically are much more aware of data that support our idea of what is happening or what will happen than disconfirming. We don't notice the disconfirming data. It's easy to tune that out naturally, not actively, but just spontaneously. So if you think you're driving your car, to a destination that you're trying to get to, and you've somehow accidentally gone off in the wrong direction, you'll see all sorts of data along the way that are letting you know that you're right, until suddenly, you can't ignore the fact that you've just crossed a state line you weren't supposed to cross, right? So it's like, oops, because we do that naturally. And so, and failure, right? Embracing the possibility of failure, especially since that's not something we love to do and think about, is particularly vulnerable to the confirmation bias problem.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of really valuable sort of self-work that comes up throughout the book, whether it's confirmation bias or attribution bias. And but you offer us many strategies on how to learn from failure. And I found it particularly enlightening. The 3 competencies that we can use to frame our practice when we practice learning from failure, which are self-awareness, situation awareness, and system awareness. It seems to me that this framework really aids us to work through those biases that we just talked about. And can you step us through how each works and how they can help us see all facets of failure?
The self-awareness, I think the tagline for self-awareness is choose learning over knowing. Know that you are at risk. We are all at risk for believing that we see reality, having that feeling of, I know what's going on. I know how to do this. I know what's going to happen next, right? That's a very natural human experience. And to actively override the knowing to choose learning is an act of self-awareness. So I say it's hard to learn when you already know. And we have that feeling of knowing. I think even in this moment, I think I see reality and know what's happening when I don't. I see reality filtered through my background, my biases, and so on. So I have to get, again, that word curious. I have to get curious. I have to force myself to be curious and interested in what's happening around me and what I might be missing, to get as interested in what I might be missing as what I know. So, and that of course helps you. That curiosity is truly mission critical in terms of preventing preventable failure, and also being willing to kind of pursue some experiments in your life or in your work that are risky, could end in failure, or could end in brand new discovery that equates as success. So the situation awareness is really 2 simple questions, right? What's at stake here in this context, in this situation, and how much is already known, or how much uncertainty is there? And if you're somewhere where the stakes are really high, whether that's from a human safety perspective or an economic, financial perspective, or reputational perspective, and uncertainty is high, please tread cautiously, right? These are in fact environments where you should be very cautious, very thoughtful, tiptoe through. But if you're somewhere where there's high uncertainty, but the stakes are incredibly low, have fun experimenting, right? Go to town. Like, why not? Play with it. But that fundamental insight to sort of size up the situation and then behave accordingly is a competency, and it's not one that I see often practiced. In fact, I see both kinds of errors. I see people behaving recklessly or non-cautiously in dangerous situations and getting hurt. And then I see people behaving, overly cautiously, like worrying about how they look in simulation environments or laboratory settings where really nobody can be hurt, right? It's just safe place to experiment. So
if I can interrupt really quickly, because I love the reference that you make when you're talking about this, about the Julia Child's pancake.
Yes. I mean, what a great story, right? Because so there she is on national television, and the pancake, drops on the counter or the floor, I can't remember which, and she just, playfully picks it back up and doesn't seem at all embarrassed or upset. And she has, I argue, rightly coded the pancake falling on the counter as low stakes, right? No big deal. Let's laugh. Let's go forward. It's a mistake. We can all make one and not feel bad about it. So she exudes that sort of wonderful, embracing of failure. And she's right. It's not high stakes. Whereas I say in the book that most of us would think of being on national television as very high stakes indeed, reputationally, but she had it right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think she identified the fact that if I think that her persona, I can't speak.
Yeah.
Her persona was very much about teaching the home cook, and it was not. She wasn't coming from an expertise kind of. I mean, she was an expert, but she was relating to the audience rather than being worried about her own expertise and perfection. So that was a really interesting and lovely little anecdote to.
Yeah, she wasn't framing it as a contest or as a showing off, but as a gift to us, right?
Look, we make mistakes.
Look what you can do, right? Look what us fallible human beings can do in the kitchen, in our very own kitchens.
So let's quickly, not that it's quick, systems are very
big,
big topic, but system awareness as well is our third practice.
System awareness is really, in a nutshell, is about overriding our tendency to think about how this affects me now, to expand our thinking to also include how this affects others in our sphere, in our work sphere, our family environment, and so forth, and how it affects other things later, right? So so many of our simple quick fixes have unintended consequences that weren't unknowable. I mean, if you paused to think about it, you'd realize that this sort of quick solution to the problem you're having right now will come back to haunt you. So that's systems thinking. It's continually asking the question, who and what else will be affected by this, and what might some of the downstream consequences be, just so you can make more thoughtful decisions. That applies to so many things in life, but it particularly relates to failure, because there are many preventable failures that could have easily been prevented with just a moment of stepping back to look at the broader system.
I think one of the reasons why I think, again, taking this entire topic and sort of, pulling on all the ways that it's applicable to our lives, and, why everyone should get the book and read it, is because we are very much stuck in this split between blaming people for failure versus blaming a system for failure. And I think what we come out with this book is that it's neither one nor the other, right? It is both. And there's a contribution from the person, and there's an effect from the system. And those two things, when we actually get those attributions correct, that's when we can actually fix the problem, as opposed to erring on one side or the other. And so I'm just curious if you got a sense as you were writing this book that there is a greater sort of social application to some of this, this identifying right and wrong failures.
Yes, I think so. And you're right. There's so many ways in which that sort of either or thinking gets us in trouble. It's either the system or the conditions sort of made it impossible for me to do well here, and or blame. If I just blame myself for everything, I'm unhealthy psychologically, and if I'm always blaming other people for the things they get wrong, I'm not very compassionate, and also not very thoughtful in a way. So this ties in so well, I think, to where we started, which is we have this, we are challenged in our ability to gain the lessons that failures offer. And now you're offering a nuance here, which is that most failures offer fuller lessons than we will immediately see, right? If we do very superficial and, okay, you just screwed up, so let's move on, that won't get us very far. But if we take the time, and it doesn't mean a lot of time, it could be just 5 minutes, but take the time to think about what were the factors of the situation, and what were the ways in which I contributed, or you contributed, or each of us contributed to the situation. We're just getting wiser and wiser, right? And think about how that prepares us to navigate forward both more effectively, but also, I think, more joyfully. And I call the last chapter, I mean, what do you call your last chapter? And how do you stop a book like this? How do you end? And I call the last chapter Thriving as a Fallible Human Being, because in a way, it all comes back to that. It comes back to the very fact of our fallibility. Like, each and every one of us is fallible. We're stuck with it. That's not going to change. And so, given that, like, what is it we can do to be joyful and thriving anyway? And part of my argument is, don't just, sort of curl up in a ball and try to stay safe. No, go out and be adventurous, whether that's, making new friends, taking on a new assignment at work, or you name it, right? But that willingness to try things that might not work is part of, a joyful and even successful journey forward.
That's a wonderful way to end our conversation, as well as end your book. And I know you sort of bring it to a close initially in the book by using discernment is what can help us do that, right? And we'll bring that back to all of the things we've talked about today, which is, when you are self-aware, and when you're analyzing the situation, when when it's low stakes or high stakes, when in all of this way that we can gain awareness, we get so much better at all of the good things, right? And so we often think of failure, the word, the experience, as being so miserable and such a negative. And even when I opened up the conversation with this Samuel Beckett's quote, and how it's just about failure is everywhere and always, that can feel very pessimistic, when in actuality, I think read this book, to everyone who is listening. And when you read this book, you're going to feel very optimistic about the ways in which that you can sort of assuage a lot of the emotional response you have to failure, and actually gain some, not control maybe, but some skills and some practices where that those things that are holding you back get resolved for you by working toward these kinds of this kind of understanding of what failure actually is. And it's so important. It's how we're going to get anywhere. And before I read my close, I'm just going to ask if you have any last takeaways for us.
Well, I'll just say, I love that you brought in the Beckett quote, which is one of my favorites. One of the really fun things about writing this book is that there's so many great failure quotes. It became hard to pick one, but since you brought up the cardiac surgery story, I thought I'd just share another one of my very favorites, which came from Robert F. Kennedy, and it opens chapter 1, and it's only those who dare to fail greatly can ever achieve greatly. And that, to me, is essentially the right kind of wrong. It's that willingness to be bold, knowing fully that you will have failure along the way, but that the payoff is great, and particularly when you do the hard work of learning from them.
I have a quote in response to your quote. But we're going to go ahead and close here. I want to remind everybody that the link is here in the webinar, where you can go and pre-order Amy's book. You, of course, can get it in bookstores. I think it's the 12th.
Actually, no, there's just a tiny and unimportant mistake.
Oh, sure.
But it is, in fact, today is the launch.
Oh my gosh.
The pub date. It was originally scheduled to be the 12th, but a few months ago it got moved up. So,
well, that's good news for everyone.
Not a failure. But I'm thrilled to be with you on the launch day.
Oh, wow, congratulations. How wonderful that is. And it is wonderful for all of us. to go back to that quote that I hinted at here, in essayist Stephen March's tract on writing and failure, published earlier this year, which is appropriate for having a newly published book, he writes, failure is the body of a writer's life. Success is only ever attire. And if we may be so bold as to sculpt that assertion a bit for our own purposes, we might say failure is the body of a person's life. And we can only truly make peace with that idea when we begin to view each failure as a fresh start, one that moves us that much closer to success, however we may define it for ourselves. Amy Edmondson's book, Right Kind of Wrong, available today, right now, gives us the practical tools and the supporting science to change the way we think about failure and embrace a life of failure that at its heart is actually a life of curiosity, creativity, and progress. Thank you, Amy. Thank you for everyone for joining us today.
Yes, thank you so much, Sally and Amy, as usual, wonderful work, Sally. And if you are interested in purchasing a copy of The Right Kind of Wrong, you should stop by, call, or follow the link to the book. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.